welcome everybody to a special management board meeting for American Lobster. Got a bit to get through today, so why don't we get right to it, and we'll start off. We were provided an agenda. We'll start off with an approval of that agenda. Does anybody have any modifications, edits, changes that they would like to see on the agenda? And sorry, I should just offer we'll be doing raising your hand virtually for asking questions and things of that nature. If you would leave your hand raised, I will put it down for you just so I can keep track of who I've called on, and you know, that way it will help us know who's got a new question, who's got an old question, that sort of thing. So does anybody have any modifications to the agenda? Please raise your hand. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands, so why don't I try, are there any objections to approving the agenda as provided? Please raise your hand if you have an objection. Seeing no hands, we will consider the agenda approved. Let's move on to the proceedings from the last meeting. We've been provided proceedings. They're in our meeting materials. Does anybody have any edits, modifications, deletions to the proceedings from our last meeting? Please raise your hand. Not seeing any hands. Let's try, are there any objections to approving the proceedings as provided? Please raise your hand. All right, cruising right along, seeing no hands, we will consider those proceedings approved. Okay, let's take a moment. Is there anyone in the public who'd like to offer a comment that is not related to our agenda for today? So if you have comments on today's agenda, please hold those. I will make some time for public comment during the meeting when we're discussing those topics. But this is an opportunity for anybody who has something they want to raise with the board that's not currently on the agenda. So if you do, please raise your hand. Okay, I don't see any hands, so there's no public comment at this time. Thanks for that. All right, well, let's get into the heart of the agenda here. We are here to talk about draft addendum, what is that, 29, I guess. Sorry, addendum 29 and Jonah Crab draft addendum 4. So I think we have a presentation that will be given by Caitlin Starks. So Caitlin, whenever you are ready, please feel free to take it away.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I am showing my screen. Please make sure you can see it.
Looks good.
Great, thank you. All right, so as our chair indicated, I'm going to be going over draft addendum 29 to amendment 3 to the American Lobster Fishery Management Plan, and that is also draft addendum 4 to the Jonah Crab Fishery Management Plan. I'm just going to call it addendum 29 today, just to make things easier. So in this presentation, I'm going to cover the background on the action leading up to this meeting, the objective of the addendum, the proposed timeline that we're working with, and then go into the details of the proposed options, along with the public comments for those options. And then I will provide the advisory panel report from our meeting last week. And then lastly, I'm going to go over the board action for consideration and next steps. So for background, the board initiated draft addendum 29 to consider vessel tracking requirements for federally permitted lobster and Jonah crab vessels in August of 2021. And the board initiated this action to address the need for some better resolution, higher resolution spatial and temporal data on effort in the fishery to address several critical issues that this fishery has been challenged with. So leading up to initiating this addendum for several years, the board has recognized the need for these
data to characterize effort specifically for improving the stock assessments for lobster and Jonah crab, helping inform decision-making to reduce fishery interactions with protected species, as well as discussions related to marine spatial planning for other ocean uses like offshore wind development, and also to improve the efficiency of law enforcement efforts in the offshore area. So to that end, the board established this objective for the addendum, which is to collect high-resolution spatial and temporal data to characterize effort in the federal American lobster and Jonah crab fisheries for management and enforcement needs. And this is the timeline of the actions development. Again, it was initiated in August 2021. And then in December of 2021, the board approved the draft addendum document for public comment. And the public comment period extended from December through January of this year. And it included 6 virtual public hearings, which I'll go over some summaries of later. And then earlier this month, the advisory panel met to review the addendum options, the public comments, and provide their advice to the board. And then today the board is meeting to review all of the public comments, the AP report, and consider taking final action on the addendum. So with that, I'll go into the proposed management options. Draft addendum 29 considers just 2 options. Option A is status quo, or no additional requirement for electronic vessel tracking in the lobster and Jonah crab fisheries. And option B is to implement electronic vessel tracking requirements for federally permitted lobster and Jonah crab vessels with commercial trap gear area permits. Under option B, federal lobster and Jonah crab vessels that are issued commercial trap gear area permits would be required to install an improved electronic tracking device to collect and transmit spatial data in order to participate in the trap gear fishery. Federally permitted vessels without an approved tracking device would be prohibited from landing lobster or Jonah crab taken with trap gear. And as such, federal permit holders would be required to install an approved device before beginning a lobster or Jonah crab fishing trip with trap gear. The device would be required to stay on board the vessel and have power at all times when the vessel is in the water, unless that device is authorized to power down by the principal port state that's identified on the permit, and that would be the state authority for that vessel. So powering down of these devices could be authorized by the state for reasons such as the vessel being hauled out or repaired, or if a device failure has been reported to the state authority, just to give a couple of examples. And then tampering with these tracking devices or their signals, including any activity that could affect the unit's ability to operate properly, would be prohibited. Option B proposes that the tracking requirements would apply to these 7 federal permit categories that are listed in this table. So these include all of the commercial trap gear area permits for areas 1 through 5 and Outer Cape Cod, and additionally the commercial trap gear area 5 waiver permit, which is was used to allow area 5 permit holders to be exempt from the more restrictive lobster trap gear specifications and trap tagging requirements in order to target black sea bass. Commercial trap gear area 6 is also excluded from these proposed electronic tracking requirements because area 6 is only in state waters. So for some additional clarity, the tracking requirements that are proposed under option B would not apply to vessels that only have a state permit and no federal permit. Inactive federal permits, which have been placed in confirmation of permit history status, and vessels that will not fish trap gear during the fishing year. So for example, if a vessel wishes to retain their lobster commercial trap gear permit but will not be fishing trap gear, they'll only be fishing with other gear under a different permit for that year, those vessels would be exempt from this requirement. So beyond the basic tracking requirements, option B in the draft addendum also provides some additional information on how the program would be implemented. This includes requirements for the devices and the vendors that they must meet in order to be approved for use in the fishery, descriptions of the administrative responsibilities and processes that would be needed at the commission, state, and federal levels, and also how the data collected by the tracking devices would be processed, stored, and provided to managers. For the minimum criteria and specifications that the tracking devices and vendors must meet, First, the devices must be able to collect location data at a rate of 1 ping per minute for at least 90% of the fishing trip. And this rate was determined to be able to differentiate fishing activity from transiting activity and allow estimation of the number of individual trawls from looking at the vessel tracks. The data for each of those pings have to include the device's current date time, its latitude and longitude, and identifiers for both the device and vessel. The devices have to meet minimum accuracy and precision requirements, as well as ruggedness specifications that allow them to function in the marine environment. And the device vendors must provide sufficient customer service as described in the addendum, and they must maintain the confidentiality of personally identifying information and all other protected data in accordance with federal law. And the implementation and enforcement of these tracking requirements will require some administrative processes at different levels, including the commission, state, and federal levels. So I'll just go through each of these in the next few slides. So at the state level, the states would be responsible for certifying that approved devices are installed on all vessels in the permit categories that we specified before the vessel goes on a fishing trip using a standard affidavit form. And the state that is responsible for each permit holder, again, would be determined by the principal port location declared on the federal permit. As for providing the states with the federal track year area permit data, GARFO will be providing that information to the states so they can determine which permit holders each state is responsible for. The states would also be responsible for providing support to their permit holders to help them with properly complying with all of the vessel tracking requirements. This doesn't mean the states would be required to help them install devices or troubleshoot devices. That would be the responsibility of the vendors. And then the states would also be responsible for data validation and compliance monitoring, including contacting permit holders if there are data issues that need to be resolved, such as incomplete tracking data or mismatches between vessel trip reports and associated vessel tracks. And then at the federal level, GARFO will be responsible for providing up-to-date information to the states on the American Lobster Track Year area permit ownership, including all of the applicable vessel permit numbers, names, hull IDs, endorsements, issuance and expiration dates, and permit holder information. GARFO will also incorporate the federal lobster EVTR data into their quality assurance program once that rulemaking is complete to implement the federal harvester electronic vessel trip report requirements. And the EVTRs will be validated to ensure data quality, and any errors that are identified through that process will be resolved by GARFO outreach efforts to correct and resubmit trip reports. ACCSP will also have near real-time access to federal EVTR data so that it can be used to identify the fishing activity from the vessel tracking data. So option B also outlines the data processes needed. The main one being that ACCSP will house the tracking data, and ACCSP will receive the location data from the tracking vendors, and they'll get the EVTR data from GARFO. So all the data must be submitted in accordance with ACCSP's trip locations API specifications. And then with those data sets, ACCSP will be able to match vessel tracks with trip reports. And as with all of the fisheries data that ACCSP handles, it will also maintain data confidentiality in accordance with federal law. And data access will only be granted to authorized entities with confidential access. With the trip report data, the state and federal agencies will remain responsible for ensuring compliance with data reporting requirements. Specifically, GARFO will be responsible for the validation of the EVTR data, and the state management agencies would be responsible for validating the trip location data. So that's the overview of the addendum options, and now I'm going to go through the public comment summary. So as I mentioned, there were 6 virtual hearings held during the comment period on Addendum 29, covering Maine through Virginia. And the total attendance across those hearings was 98, though there were some folks that attended more than one hearing, so it's slightly less individuals than 98. At those hearings, 35 public comments were provided, and during the comment period, we also got 32 written comments on the addendum. This table summarized the comments that were provided at the public hearings in favor of each of the two options. So across the hearings, we had 27 comments in favor of option A, status quo, and 3 were in favor of B for electronic vessel tracking requirements. The second table is a summary of the written comments, and I'll note that not all written comments were clear on which of the options was preferred, so only the comments that actually specified a preferred option are included in the table. Of the 25 comments that specified an option they preferred, 16 preferred option A, and 13 of those came from individuals and 3 from organizations. And then 9 written comments were in favor of option B, with 2 of those from individuals and 7 from organizations. The next couple of slides summarize some of the more common themes across the comments that we received. So these comments are in support of status quo. Among these, many comments mentioned concerns that data from vessel tracking would harm the fishery rather than help or be used against the industry in some way. Several people were concerned that it would be inappropriate to use the tracking data to define static use areas for the fishery for marine spatial planning efforts because the fishery is dynamic and important fishing areas are likely to change over time. Another common theme among the comments was that fishermen should not be financially responsible for the collection of these data, but that the commission, the states, and/or NOAA fisheries should provide funding to pay for the devices and data costs. Along with that, it was often mentioned that the devices and data plans would be too costly for small business operators. And then a number of comments highlighted concerns about fishermen losing days at sea due to device malfunction. Some more reasons for supporting status quo included opposition to having to have multiple types of devices for different fisheries on a single vessel, not having enough information about the devices, the vendors' actual cost of the devices, their reliability and accessibility, as well as their power needs. Concerns about data privacy were another common theme, with a few people being concerned that the data would be accessible by entities or other individuals who shouldn't have access to it, and also some who simply thought that the tracking devices would be an invasion of their privacy, given that vessels are sometimes used for activities other than fishing, like recreation. One letter from an organization suggested that instead of implementing Addendum 29, the board should fully implement the reporting requirements and improvements from Addendum 26 and the recommendations within that addendum to satisfy the objectives of draft Addendum 29. Other comments also mentioned existing data from trip reports and logbooks should be fully utilized instead of requiring trackers. And finally, there were some concerns that the tracking data are still going to be somewhat limited because they cannot provide information on lobster catch rates. So of the comments that were given in support of option B, many of them highlighted the concern that the current spatial information for the lobster fishery is too coarse and higher resolution data is needed to help with the stock assessment and right whale risk reduction efforts. Some also supported option B because of longstanding concerns about the lack of or limitations of offshore law enforcement. Several comments also noted that tracking data would be of enormous value to understanding economic trade-offs for management measures like area closures and marine spatial planning decisions, as well as for enforcing other management measures required by the Atlantic Large Whale Take Reduction Plan. And some supporters of option B also thought the vessel tracking data should be required as soon as possible to start collecting this information. Some other general comments that were provided were that financial support to reduce or eliminate the cost for fishermen could reduce resistance to this proposal, that the commission should consider allowing the use of existing AIS technology to meet the requirements of the program. They said that ASMC should follow this action up with an addendum that would improve harvest reporting in state waters as well as federal waters. And lastly, that the electronic vessel tracking requirements should not apply to the Area 5 waiver permits. There were multiple comments that supported that idea. So that's the overview of the public comments, and now I have a few slides for the advisory panel report. Our Lobster AP chair is here today at the meeting, but I agreed to give the slides for Grant, but he is here to answer questions if needed. So for the Lobster and Jonah Crab advisory panels, we had a joint meeting of those two panels on February 15th, 2022 to review the addendum options. 8 Lobster AP members attended and 3 Jonah Crab AP members attended. 5 advisors of the total supported option A and 3 advisors supported option B. So the AP members that preferred option A for status quo brought up several of the same issues discussed in the public comments. One Jonah Crab advisor said there are still too many unanswered questions about how the program would work and how the data would be used. A few advisors also said the tracking program should be funded by agencies benefiting from the data like NOAA Fisheries. And then similar to public comments, several AP members highlighted the issue of the fishery being spatially dynamic and tracking data from one year will not reflect past or future areas of importance. And to that point, another AP member indicated that a baseline for the fishery footprint should be established from the tracking data over several years before the spatial information should be used for management or marine spatial planning or assessments. Several AP members also argue that there should be 100% harvester reporting before tracking is required, because without that harvester reporting aspect, the tracking data will not be as useful. One Lobster advisor was also doubtful in general that these data would actually benefit the fishery in terms of protecting them against wind development, because either they believe wind areas have already been planned in most of the areas, or it will not be important to the wind developers to avoid fishing areas. And then a few advisors also felt that the addendum is moving too quickly and more time is needed to set up the program. Of the advisors that supported option B for the tracking requirements, most recognize that there's a need to be able to prove where the fishery is occurring and with those tracking data for all of the reasons that were discussed in the addendum. One advisor supported this option because they felt tracking will fill the gap in law enforcement in the offshore area. Some of the advisors stated that the need for better spatial data outweighs some of the potential risks. Another added that they hope these data can be used to resolve gear conflicts. And then a few advisors felt that more precise spatial data similar to what's being proposed under this addendum would have benefited the fishery during the development of the Canyons and Seamounts Marine National Monument, as well as the New England Fishery Management Council's Deep Sea Coral Amendment. And then lastly, advisors supporting option B also agreed that the tracking data would help improve the stock assessment to better manage the lobster and Jonah crab stocks. So with that, these are the next steps for the board to consider. Today, if desired, the board can consider final action on the addendum. And if it does get approved today, or when it gets approved, the states would begin their processes to implement the requirements of the addendum in their state regulations. And the commission would also move forward with forming the work group that would identify and approve vendors and tracking devices for use in the fishery. And the federal rulemaking process would also begin. And the guidance that we've received from NOAA so far has been that they expect to be able to implement the tracking requirements in time for the 2023 fishing year. So that's the end of my presentation. And before we go to our next section, I guess, Jason, do you want to take any questions?
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin. I think that's a good idea. So awesome presentation as always, very concise representation of what was a lot of work, a lot of meetings. So thank you for that, Caitlin. And thanks to the AP for that great report. I thought there were some thoughtful comments there. And I think Captain Moore is on the line here in case anybody has questions on the AP report. So with that, why don't we go to questions on the presentation. Please raise your hand if you have any questions. And I've got one to lead us off. David Borden, go ahead, David.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Caitlin, I'd just like to start by complimenting you on the job you did at the hearings. I thought you did a really excellent job with a difficult situation. Not all of the answers that you were or questions you were being asked had been answered by the board and the TC, and I think you handle yourself very well. So my question is that on timing, and a lot of the questions that were made by the industry, I put into the category of there are logical responses that the board and TC can provide to those. And if we were to take the time to delay this for a month, let's say, then what impact would that have on the implementation schedule?
Thanks for that question, David. So Caitlin, I don't know if you want to take a crack at that. I know we have some folks from NOAA on the line here as well that may wish to weigh in, but do you want to start it off?
Sure, thanks, Mr. Chair. So my understanding is that a delay of a month or so would likely not impact the ability of NOAA to finalize rulemaking in time for the 2023 fishing year, but I think it would become a little bit tight. So I guess I'd like to have or ask Allie Murphy from NOAA to add to that if she has more specifics.
Yeah, thanks, Allie. If you'd like to weigh in, please feel free to go ahead and unmute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yep, we gotcha.
Great. Thanks, Caitlin. I think you represented that very well. I think, you know, what we generally say is that if compatible federal rulemaking is required from a commission action, to expect about a year for us to get that done. You know, I think potentially a delay of a month might mean a slight delay on our part, but you know, we've still got some time to ahead of the start of the fishing year to potentially get this in place.
Awesome. Thank you, Allie, and thank you, Caitlin. Next question, I see Cherie Patterson. Go ahead, Cherie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This question is for Allie. Allie, is the reporting for federal lobster permittees still in line for January of 2023?
Allie, if you feel like you want to weigh in on that, I guess you should stay close to your mute button there. So please feel free.
Will do. Thank you. Hi, Cherie. Yes, we are still targeting January 1st, 2023. The rule is off my desk and in the review chain right now, so I'm hoping for a publication real soon.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Cherie. Thanks, Allie. Other questions from folks at this point? Dan McKiernan, go ahead, Dan.
Thank you, Jason. My question has to do with the timing and how much of a deal breaker it would be if we didn't meet our time goal. Specifically, if NOAA is going to require, with any luck, January 1st as the time for the mandatory EVTRs. And our goal was to get these devices on by the beginning of the fishing year, which I believe is May 1. If we were to fail to meet our goals, and that would be accomplished, say, a month later, or 2 months later, or 6 months later, is that a problem? And I guess it's kind of an open-ended question. And what could we proceed in such a way that even if we were to delay this, but get it in at a later date, would that still be a useful outcome to meet the goals of this program?
Thanks, Dan. I think that's the NOAA question again. Caitlin, if you want to weigh in, please jump in. Otherwise, maybe Allie can bail us out again.
Jason, I might be able to help a little here. I mean, Dan, I think it depends on which goal of the addendum you're speaking to. I think one of the more immediate needs that folks have been discussing is these unknown whale rule regulations and how this data can help us have more precise information about N-line and N-line usage for incorporation into the take reduction team's models. And so the longer you delay, the less data we have to add to the take reduction team models. I assume that if they are going to be re-reviewing the progress of the rules that were just implemented this past year in 2025, that you'll want a full year's worth of data for 2023 to add to those modeling approaches that will probably start to be done in 2024. I mean, that would be the most immediate need. As you know, wind energy uses issues are happening as we speak. So obviously, the sooner you can get information to support the industry, the better. The delay is, impacts your individual states and how you're working with the different leases off of different state waters.
Could I follow up?
Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
So thanks, Tony. That's a great answer. I guess what I take away from that is we needed this data yesterday, and if this were delayed any fragment of the year, it's not as if we lose an entire year, because as it stands, the EVTRs and the trackers were on its different schedule anyway. So I just want to be clear that I think, to me, this is an important addendum that I'm going to do all I can to get past, and I'm just trying to strategize about what any delay would create in terms of its effectiveness. And it sounds to me like it would be just a proportional reduction in the data. We wouldn't be missing an entire year, for example. Not like in other species that we manage, we need to get it done before like the fish arrive for that year. Like this is an in-season requirement that if the season were a tad delayed, I think we would still be accomplishing a lot. So I'll thank you for letting me ask those questions and make those comments.
Thanks, Dan. I've got another hand, Richie White. Go ahead, Richie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to follow up on those, so I'm sure I'm understanding the timing here. So if we delayed action and approved this at our May meeting, and the service took a year to approve their end, so that would mean the 2023 fishing year beginning in May, then the service could have this in place. Am I figuring this out right?
Tony, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think, Richie, approving it in May, you're starting to get dangerously close to the start of the fishing season. I would, I think that if you want a full implementation starting at the beginning of the fishing season in 2023, you might want to approve this sooner than later. And that you need to have, it's good to have a little buffer room in there. in order to make sure for those states that need the federal implementation prior to going to rulemaking will have that. There are several states that don't necessarily need federal implementation prior to them starting to work on their own rulemaking to administer the programs. But there are some states, I think, that do. Maybe New Hampshire is one of them, if I'm remembering correctly. So waiting until May could be problematic to get the beginning of the fishing year.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Richie. Thanks, Tony. Okay, any other hands from board members with questions? All right, not seeing any. Here's what I'd like to do for the meeting at this point. So, heard a lot of questions, sort of wondering and pondering the impacts of a potential delay in final action. And so I thought one of the kind of set the rest of, there's some additional slides after the one you're looking at here, where we can kind of step through some of the questions that came up during the public hearing and really kind of dig into them a little bit and try and understand or try and come to consensus on the response to make sure we've captured all of the important elements to be able to report back to our constituents in the various states. So before we get into that, I thought it might make sense to see if there is a motion anybody wants to make before we launch into any additional discussion like the one I just discussed. So why don't I look for a hand for a potential motion to kind of spawn some of that additional conversation. I've got a hand, Sherry Patterson. Go ahead, Sherry.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to move to postpone action on the Lobster draft addendum 24 and Jonah Crab 29 and Jonah Crab draft addendum 4 until the next meeting of the American Lobster Management Board, which is to be held before the ASMFC spring meeting. So we want to get this done before that year is needed for NOAA to be able to initiate action. If I get a second, then I can provide some more justification. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Sherry. Looking for hands for a second, and I see David Borden. Thank you, David. So we've got a motion. It's been seconded. And why don't I come back to you, Sherry, to finish your thoughts on it. We'll then give Mr. Borden a chance, and then we can get into some discussion. And I promise to allow for some public discussion as well. And then we can launch into looking through those questions that came up. So go ahead, Sherry, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. During the public hearings for these two amendments, the industry had consistent questions amongst all the states and on the program as a whole that really could not be answered well. So I think we should postpone until the tracking program has developed more fully, where we can answer questions or concerns the industry has expressed, and also to assure the states, ASMFC and NOAA are aligned with also with the program standards that should be developed. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. David, would you like to offer some comments?
Sure. Just make a couple of brief comments. I support this. I virtually attended most of the hearings, and I thought the industry up and down the coast asked a lot of really good questions. Some of those questions need to be worked on by the board and also the technical committee, and a delay would certainly work to the advantage of all of us. I think it's incumbent upon the process to try to deal with issues like how will these data be used and who gets access to these data. We can't do that after the fact. We need to talk through those types of issues in advance, and a temporary delay will allow that. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Okay, so let's, we've got a motion on the board. Let's take some comments, questions, whatever from board members first. Got a couple of hands up. The first is Dennis Abbott. Go ahead, Dennis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, there's an old proverb that says that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I'm not sure if that's not the road we're on in trying to hasten through this addendum. There's a lot of concerns raised by people at the hearings, which I attended the New Hampshire one, and a lot of the things that before we can even approve this at the next meeting, questions that should be answered. I mean, starting off, in my mind, so far, this is an unfunded mandate. And it's been stated in the answers to the questions that we could receive some resources from the federal government to mitigate the cost of this. I think the document needs to contain more information regarding, in particular, regarding what a fisherman does or can do or can't do if he has problems with a unit after it's installed on the boat. I also am concerned, just in a general sense, and being the devil's advocate that I often am, that we're asking lobster fishermen to purchase something to be used, and in their minds, it could be used against them. And it's sort of like self-incrimination in some ways. I do understand the need for, you know, large whales and the wind business and all of that. But I think that we have to go about this more carefully. You know, Garfo in Mike Pentony's letter talked about they're still working out details. So I think that there's a lot of details to be worked out. Another thing that came to my mind was the use by law enforcement. What will be the detailed procedure for law enforcement to access this information, to, you know, to start an investigation, to further an investigation, so on and so forth? How do they go about this? There's just a lot of questions. And then you get into the maintenance of the trackers. I was thinking about having a tracker on, I don't have a lobster boat, but I'm just comparing it to myself sitting here at home with Comcast gear that runs my TVs and internet and so on and so forth, and the amount of problems I have and when I have to have a repairman come or return a unit. And I'm wondering how purchasing units from different vendors will work with lobstermen who have a malfunctioning unit and they're waiting for somebody to come and fix it. Who's going to pay for it? Are they going to have to buy a new unit? So on and so forth. So all these things that I mentioned, I think that they need answers before we can actually approve this addendum. You know, it's one thing to say we have to get it done by a particular time, but it's more important to get it done when it's done right. So I praise Caitlin for all the work she's done on this and everyone else that's been involved. But again, remember that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. I hope we're not on the road to hell here. And just a note, I think as you're kind of ticking through the questions that are in your mind, I think we've got, and I keep mentioning that I've got a series of slides here that kind of tick through the questions. I think they're all here. So, you know, since we have until about 3 o'clock, I thought it'd be a good use of our time to kind of go through, kind of outline the current responses to a lot of the questions that you just raised, Dennis, and just make sure that we're all sort of comfortable with those, and where we're not, we can do that additional investigation as you suggested, to make sure we get everything kind of tightened up as well as we can. So good comments. Next up, I have Steve Train. Go ahead, Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And if I can go back to Dennis for a little bit, if you want a lobster boat, boy, have I got a deal for you. I'm going to support this motion, but I have some reluctance, and it's the hard deadline on the end. I think there are a lot of unanswered questions here, and I think we need to take the time to get the questions answered and answered satisfactorily without a hard deadline on the back end. The lobster fishery is a difficult fishery to enforce rules in because of the vast area we cover and the number of people. Most of the rules are obeyed because they're believed in. And when you shove something down somebody's throat they don't buy into, it changes the outlook of the entire way they operate. And I just don't think that that's a good idea. I think we need to take the time, regardless of how long it takes, to answer these questions to the satisfaction of industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Good comments. Let's see. Next up, I have Megan Ware. Go ahead, Megan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I am prepared to support this motion today. I think there were very legitimate questions asked by the public during the comment period, and we owe it to our stakeholders to answer those questions prior to taking action. So in that spirit, I will support this. In the same breath, I'll say I do think this is a high priority issue for the board, given the vast amount of challenges facing this fishery. So I guess to respectfully disagree with my compatriot from Maine, I like that it has a specific deadline. I think it keeps us focused on this topic. If we find at that meeting we still haven't answered all of the questions, I think it provides a progress point for us to continue to work on those. So I support the motion as written today. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. And one more hand for the time being. That's Richie White. Go ahead, Richie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with all that's been said so far. I don't believe a month it will nearly be enough to properly answer these questions. And I think more than getting the answers to these questions, I want to see a lot of these answers be written in the addendum. We had testimony from some fishermen that were involved in when VMS was approved, and I was around them, but I don't remember the hearings and whatnot. And they said that, oh yeah, we were told a lot of things. Oh yeah, we're going to take care of that as this unfolds, and we're going to work. And and they said it turned out differently than what they were told in the beginning. So I think it's important that we put in writing in the addendum, for example, the issue of if the box doesn't work, can you go fishing? And who do you contact? And how long do you have to contact the person about the box not working? So, I mean, those things that, you know, we're going to take care of them. I think we need to take care of them and have it in the addendum so it's very clear to the fishermen exactly how this is going to work. Thank you.
Thanks, Richie. So, you know, I think we do have some, at least initial responses to some of these questions. So as I keep mentioning, we'll kind of tick through those and see what we think. To your larger point, I'm going to look to Caitlin or Tony. I don't know what that, so a modification to the document at this point to add some language, maybe you can make a comment about that. And if it's not, if that would be something that would trigger a whole new public process, perhaps there is some other way, because in the end, we have these questions, we're going to try and develop some answers. Then what? You know, we need to get that information out to the public again in some way, shape, or form. So I'm wondering, Tony or Caitlin, if you want to comment on at least the process issue with changing the addendum at this point.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I can start off and then Tony, you can confirm, but I do believe if we were to make that kind of modification, we might have to take it back out for public comment. To that point, though, we, from the beginning of developing this addendum, have talked about having a complementary document that goes along with it that would lay out all of these details for the states and partners to use. So that was the intention, if this were approved, would be to put together a consistent document for all of the states to be able to have, to be following the same guidance on how to implement this program and answering the questions that Richie White brought up. So Tony, please add if you feel the need.
I'll just add to what Caitlin said, like even specific to some of the things that Richie just brought up, we intentionally made some of these things more open to allow the states to administer the programs that met their regulatory and administrative processing needs, because we know that some states have different processes that they need to go through in order to implement such a program. And so we were trying to provide that flexibility to have some of the same overarching standards, but then to give that flexibility to the states in order to get it done within their administrative protocols. I think we would have to go out for public comment again if we made major changes to the document itself. And since I have the microphone, Mr. Chairman, it would be really helpful as we went through these questions for the board to indicate where they're not satisfied with the answers that we have provided. In a lot of cases, some of the questions that I'm hearing right now are going to be specific to each of the individual states and how their administrative processes undergo to implement the addendum. And so we'll need the states to help us answer these questions specific to how you see your state administering the program. And so it just will be very helpful to Caitlin and I, if you could, as we go through, is the board satisfied with the answer? If they're not satisfied with the answers, then what additional information are you looking for?
Awesome, thank you, Tony. Richie, follow up?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes. So Tony, in response to what you just said, then it would be, it could be possible then that each state would have different set of regulations as to whether a fisherman can fish when the box does not work, and also who they contact and how long they have to contact it. So that wouldn't be what you were saying, I believe, and correct me please if I'm wrong, that would not be in the document. Therefore, all the states would not have the same response to that. Am I hearing that correctly?
I mean, so in response to that question, what happens if my device isn't working? You know, in our SOPS protocols of what we're thinking about putting forward is that it's not our intention to prohibit a fisherman who has been making a good faith effort to work with the state and the vendor to get their device fixed. Depending on what's going on with the device, it may mean that the device has to be sent back to the vendor. The vendor may have to send them a new device. It may be just a simple tweak that, you know, who knows, that could be fixed in a day or two. But what the state does to provide that clearance to that industry member could be different for each state and how they want to set something up. Maybe it's a call-in number for some states. Maybe it's an email that gets sent to someone. That part I can't answer how someone is going to do that. But if they're making a good faith effort to get the device fixed, then it is not the intention to tie someone to the dock. the exact process is up to each individual state.
And if I
Right.
could just to that.
Yep, go ahead. I think
Yeah.
that's Kate.
I just wanted to say that in the addendum document on page 7, it says if option B is adopted, a separate document will be developed that will include additional details and standard operating procedures to guide the management agencies in implementing the vessel tracking requirements. So I think a question like Richie just brought up about how long people would have to contact, we can think about that through this standard operating procedures document, and if the states all agree, we can put a standard in that would be consistent. But if the states have different ways that they're thinking about implementing these types of rules, then we can make that guidance flexible enough to allow the states to use whatever works best for them.
Thanks, Caitlin. Yeah, and I'd like to chime in as well. I think one of the nice things about the commission is it's an organization of the states, and the reason it works well is because we all understand that we all have nuances in our states that allow us or require us to do things a little bit differently. So just to restate, I think the higher level, can you go fishing if your tracker is not working properly? There's going to be a higher level answer to that everyone's going to abide by. And then the logistical elements that each state requires to sort of, allow that to happen, that's where the differences will be. So, it's kind of hierarchical, but it should work. So it won't be inconsistent on the main topics, just the sort of working logistics will be a little bit different. Rhode Island and Maine are different places. So they require, Rhode Island, you could bring your tracker in, no matter where you are in the state, it'd be about a 20-minute drive, not the same for Maine. So, that's what we're kind of talking about there. I've got a few more hands up. Just a quick look at the clock. It's 2 o'clock. We're supposed to wrap up by 3, and there are quite a few questions. So I'm just sort of cautioning folks that I want to be able to, number one, allow the public to weigh in here a little bit, and I'll get to sort of some criteria there, and then I want to make sure we can get through a good slug of these questions. So the first hand I saw was Allie Murphy. Go ahead, Allie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think like others who have spoken, I'm generally supportive of postponing action on this. I think between the questions that have been raised here and in the and by board members, there are some details that need to be worked out here before this should move forward. And as we were just talking, as the conversation was just going, I'm starting to get a little nervous by hearing all of the states are going to do very different things. If we are required to do federal rulemaking, we'll have to comply with things like the Paperwork Reduction Act, which means we'll need to have an idea of how the states intend to handle some of these scenarios, and hopefully do so in a somewhat uniform way. So just want to put a pin in that. I think there are some additional details to be worked out. Thanks.
Thanks, Allie. Next up, I have Dave Borden. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just quickly want to encourage all the board members to take up the motion. I mean, the motion does nothing more than set the stage for us to then have a detailed discussion on all the specifics that we've been discussing for the past 15 minutes. So please, let's take up the motion, and then, as the board chair indicated, he'll lead us into the specifics with the staff. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Appreciate the help. So I do have a couple of remaining hands. If you like what David said and you want to abide by it, you can lower your hand, but I will call on the hands that I see. So the first is Eric Reed. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would reluctantly support this motion. I agree with Mr. McKiernan that yesterday would be best. And I would caution the board and the industry on any delay in collecting hard data. And I do agree that the devil is in the details, but it's my experience that anecdotal information, especially when it comes to fishing effort and history, will not cut it, especially when it comes to 2 4-letter words, mitigation and compensation. So that's where I'm at. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Eric. And then the final hand I have here is Dennis Abbott. Go ahead, Dennis.
Yes, thank you. I agree with David Borden, knowing that he's one that always tries to run a very quick meeting. But let me say that, could I ask the question about the need for making changes in the document and requiring a series of public hearings? For instance, to put into the document the fact that having a tracker that's not operable will not stop a fisherman from going fishing. Would that require another public hearing, or does that not make sense in putting that in there? Because again, that was one of the things that the fishermen were very concerned about, was having a tracker inoperable and being told they can't go fishing. Thanks.
Thanks, Dennis. Tony or Caitlin, a response to that?
I'll just stick with what we said before. Major changes to the document, which were not originally in the document, make it difficult for us to not take it back out for comment. As we said, we were in the hearings, we did tell people that it was not the intention to hold people at the docks when the trackers weren't working, if someone was making good faith effort to have that tracker fixed. So we did inform the public of that. But it's the process that we have followed at the commission. And I'm not saying that it would be up to the board to decide if they want to do more hearings. It could just sit out for 30 days, but again, it would just be an additional delay, which will start to bump up against the beginning of the fishing year.
Thanks, Tony. All right, I've got one more hand. I'm going to go to that final hand. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out to the public with a plea caveat that we are going to go through and step through these questions one by one. My sense is that if you have questions, they might be answered, or if not, I can go back out to the public at the conclusion of the questions, and you can add in at that point. If anybody wants to talk about the motion directly before we vote on it, that's, I think, completely appropriate. So I just wanted to kind of set the stage there. And it looks like Dan McKiernan has put his hand down. So, so at this point, why don't I go ahead and do that? So looking to the public, if anybody wants to make a comment or has a question about the motion, now's the time for that, keeping in mind that the questions that everyone keeps referring to, we're going to go through in some detail for the next 55 minutes or so. So questions, comments from the public on the motion. Please raise your hand, sorry. Okay, well, thank you. No questions from the public. Back to the board. Let's take.
Jay, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. There was someone who provided a question in the question box. His name was Gregory Matronis.
Let's see.
Tina, I believe that the statement was that if there's another chance for a member of the public to make a comment, they would be able to do it after this motion is taken up.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I see that. Sorry, I just popped the box out. And it's Greg Mataronis. And Greg, yes, I promised to provide another opportunity for a public comment. And it might be more worthwhile, like once we kind of get through the questions a little bit, and I think that will be more valuable for the public. So thanks for sitting tight there. Okay, let's take, hopefully folks have had a little bit of time to think about this, but I feel often rushed on these virtual meetings with trying to communicate with my counterparts. So I do want to give a little time just so everyone can confirm the votes within their state. So let's do a 2-minute caucus, then we will come back and call the question. Is there a little timer or something we can put up on the board? All right. 2 minutes should be good. And yeah, 2 minutes and we'll be back. Thanks, everybody. Okay, there's 2 minutes. Does anybody need a little more time to communicate with their fellow commissioners? Please raise your hand if you need more time. Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands. So why don't we get to it then? We've got the motion on the board. Move to postpone action on Lobster Draft Addendum 29 and Jonah Crab Draft Addendum 4 until the next meeting of the American Lobster Management Board, which will be held before the ASMFC spring meeting. Motion by Ms. Patterson, seconded by Mr. Borden. All those in favor, please signify by raising your virtual hand. And Tony, I assume you're keeping track of this part.
Yep, I'll read the states out loud. I just want to give it 1 second to settle. I have New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Delaware, New Jersey, Maine, Maryland, Virginia, New Hampshire, and NOAA fisheries. I will clear the hands. All right, I'm ready.
Thank you, Tony. All those opposed to the motion, please signify by raising your hand.
I do not have any hands up for no's.
Okay, thank you. Any abstentions? Please raise your hand.
I don't have any hands up and abstentions.
And finally, any null votes, please raise your hand.
I don't have any null votes, and I think I counted 10 states in favor. Jason, Caitlin, does that
I can confirm that.
confirm?
I had
Thanks.
10 as well.
Yeah, pardon me, Mr. Chairman, this is Ray Kane from Massachusetts. I was just informed that I was asked to vote for the state and we vote in favor.
Thank
Okay.
you, Ray.
Thank you, Ray.
That is, then that would be 11 states in favor.
Thank you, Ray. Okay, so the motion passes. Thank you all very much for that. Motion passes 11 to 0 to 0 to 0, I think. 3 zeros.
Correct.
Thanks. Great. All right. So with that, thanks everybody. Nice job getting that set up. Now, without further ado, let's launch into the questions. Again, the intent here is to sort of look at the questions that came up. We've kind of collated all of the questions that came up during the hearings, as well as conversations folks had afterwards, collected all of those and have attempted some responses to those questions. So that's what we will step through here. Let's pace ourselves. We don't want to spend, there's I think about 10 or 12 questions. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. And it may come to a point where we'll just need to move on, understanding that we'll need to kind of flesh out the answer a little more before the next meeting. So very first question, I think a very important one that came up at a lot of the hearings is who will pay for the tracking devices? So just to be upfront, at this time, there's no dedicated funds to pay for the trackers. I think folks generally understand that. However, there's some reason to be optimistic. There are investigations that are underway to find dedicated funds to assist with at least paying for part of the costs associated with the trackers, something like the device and then a year of the service, that kind of a thing. And further, the trackers are eligible for funding under the House and Senate report language for the 2022 budget. So if that budget is approved, it could help subsidize these devices, but we're not going to know the result of that until later in the winter, early spring here, March, thereabouts. So that is where we're at on the tracking devices. There's nothing, nothing we can commit to at this time, but some reason to be optimistic. So looking for hands to make comments or questions or anything on this particular question. Please raise your hand. Dan McKiernan?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I guess I would want to reframe this by being more clear to say that it's the expectation that the permit holders would be paying for the trackers, but that many of us in various agencies are seeking costs that would defray that. So I imagine that even if there were a grant program, it would be a reimbursement. But I think to be clear to the public, I think the expectation is the vessel would pay for it. And again, if there was funding available, I think it would be a reimbursement. Or maybe others have a different view of how a grant program would be executed, especially when there's language about partial costs. So.
Dan, I think it could be, sorry, Mr. Chair, is it okay if I respond to Dan?
Yes, please.
Dan, I think it could be one of two things, as you said, either a reimbursement through a grant program, or it could be that a state would take the funds and pay for the trackers themselves and disperse the trackers. I think it could go either way if there was enough funding to cover the tracking device itself. And
Right.
the other.
Right, but Tony, ultimately, this is going to be a multi-year program, and I'm expecting that even if the upfront costs were supported with some kind of government funds, it would still be a contract between the vessel owner or the permit holder and the vendor, which then has to be continued to be paid even beyond whatever funds might be made available temporarily. I just want to be clear, because it's kind of a dodged, if the question is who will pay for the tracking devices, in my mind, it's the permit holders.
Agreed. And Jason, the other thing that I just wanted to make sure that is also clear about cost is that during the hearings, I think a lot of folks equated the cost of trackers and the service fee for trackers to be very similar to VMS devices. And I just want to make sure that the board understands that these trackers are a fraction of the cost of VMS devices, and the service contract fees, the annual fees, are also a fraction of that as well.
Yep, good point, Tony. Thanks for that. Okay, another hand, Dave Borden. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I agree with Dan's point that we should have some language in here about reimbursement, and would just say that my own view is if this moves forward, I could even see the commission paying for some of the cost for tracking devices in certain areas. And I just cite an example. There are so few fishermen that fish south of Rhode Island that I mean, the commission could cover that cost out of its current operating budget, in my own view, for a pretty insignificant amount of money. Given the fact that we're not traveling to meetings and we're saving all this money on travel, there's got to be some surplus money. And as far as up north, I think the language about reimbursement covers my concern, because I have every expectation that some of the people that are working on this issue are going to try to provide reimbursement in the next budget. Thank you.
Tony, a response to that?
Thank you, Jason. So David, the commission's operating budget doesn't have extraneous dollars to pay for research and funding for such things as trackers. The money that has been saved through the lack of travel has gone back to the states. So we've dispersed those funds. So if there were extra dollars to be spent on something, it would be up to the states themselves to decide how that funding would be utilized. So I can't make any commitment to say that we would be able to pay for those trackers from for those individuals, because we just don't have those extraneous dollars in our budget.
Okay, thanks, Tony, and thanks, David, for the thought there. Okay, so we've had a couple of comments to modify this a little bit. We've recorded that. Timothy Field, I do see your hand. I want to get like a couple of questions under our belt here, and then I promise to come out to the public. You can keep your hand up, and I will come to you, but I'm just wanted you to know why I'm flipping to the next question here. Try and batch these a little bit. So next slide. Okay. There were a lot of questions about, you know, the research that went into the tracking devices, how many vessels were involved, that sort of thing. So this one is a pretty straightforward one. We're just kind of providing the results or the numbers from the various states. And there's a little bit of nuance in here. So for the state of Maine, they have looked at tracking devices from 3 different vendors, tested them on 18 lobster vessels, And they also had several vessels, 20, that had trackers on them that are in the urchin fishery. And then, as was the case for most of the states, they also tested them out on some of the state vessels as well. In the case of Maine, it was the Marine Patrol vessels. So Massachusetts, they deployed trackers on 5 vessels and some of their state research vessels, as well as a recreational vessel or 2. And then in Rhode Island, we had so from 2019 through 2021, we had some different cellular tracking devices that got tested on 3 of our state-owned research vessels. That was part of an ACCSP project. And then we've also been running a pilot program with commercial vessels. Some of them are lobster vessels, but not all of them. And that was 25 different commercial fishing vessels that we tested the trackers out on. So that's basically what we have. So are there any comments or additional information from other states that they want to add into the list here? Looking for hands. Richie White, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Are there any results from these tests? So can we provide how these devices held up? Was the data supplied? The type of data that we're looking to accumulate? What were the issues? So I think those are what the industry is going to want to see. I mean, they also want to see how many, but also what were the results? Thank you.
Thanks, Richie. Yeah, Caitlin, do you want to take that one? I'm guessing it exists already in a PDT or a TC document. Caitlin?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So there was one analysis report provided actually as an appendix to the addendum. So that is in there. It's a ping rate analysis from Maine's tests on these devices. And then previous to this, the pilot electronic tracking projects were presented to the board last year, I believe, or potentially even before that. So again, there was a pilot project that was implemented through Addendum 26, and that project has been presented to the board previously. There is a report for that as well. I can always follow up and send those out if needed.
Thanks, Caitlin. Follow up, Richie, is that good?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now, just that be provided, is part of our response to the questions, I think, so that industry, sees it as part of this response. Thank you.
Gotcha. Thanks for that. Okay. Ray Kane, go ahead, Ray. Oh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, and also included in results on this testing, I think what the harvesters might be looking for are price controls, price concerns. I realize 3 vendors, a limited number of vessels, but as this gets implemented and you've got thousands of lobstermen, prices should come down. But I would like to see that included in this document. A ballpark figure of some sort.
If I could ask for clarification, Mr. Chair.
Yep, please do. Go ahead, Caitlin.
Thanks. So there were prices provided again in the initial report from the pilot tracking project. That was a couple of devices that were tested, and ranges of those prices were provided previously to the board. And we did provide that information in the public comments or in the public hearings as well. We did not want to include that information in the actual document because we didn't want to kind of, I guess, identify particular vendors and hold them to any prices that may change over time. So I guess I'm trying to figure out what specific price information would be helpful, because we have already provided ranges of prices on the various devices that were tested.
Follow up, Ray?
Yeah, well, I'll reiterate. So these prices, I presume, were on a limited number of trackers. Now, mandating this through a management action, you're going to have thousands of people who need to go to these vendors. And I should think the price would drop substantially. But I think that's got to be included in this document someplace.
If I could, Tony, maybe you have something to add. I just don't see a way that we're going to be able to get these vendors to give us prices when we don't have an actual mandate in place now. Tony, you've probably talked with some folks about this as well.
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin. I think, Ray, the tricky part is that depending on the number of devices that get approved and how the states decide how they're going to work with vendors, it may be that, say 60% of the folks go with one vendor, their price then may come down significantly, and whereas another vendor may hold on to their price, and we can ask what their pricing would be. But again, the prices have dramatically changed, or I shouldn't say dramatically changed, but they have dropped since we started these projects 2 and 3 years ago. And so I just don't know if it's going to be all that telling, because it may be their price may be one thing if you order 10 devices. It may be a different if they get 300 devices. And without knowing how many devices will be ordered from that particular vendor, it's very difficult for us to get a solid price.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Ray.
Thank
So
you.
just the response to that is, I think we do have some kind of preliminary information that will give folks a sense of what they're looking at, and hopefully it will be better when it actually comes time to buy it. But there's a lot of uncertainties there that none of us can, including the vendors, can kind of control. So I think that's the best we're going to be able to do there. Next up, I have Dan McKiernan. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to follow up on Richie's question, because I find it interesting that there have been trackers on a number of vessels over 4 or 5 years. I think it would be useful to describe the failure rate for the skeptical permit holders. So I see here 25 on commercial vessels in Rhode Island, and I don't know what the failure rate has been on that, but I think that would help clarify the potential problems or the non-problems of the devices. Could someone speak to that, or could that be added to this answer? Not only how many vessels were involved, but what was the track record, or what was the success rate of the testing? Or maybe that's in another slide. So I'll take my answer after I mute.
Yeah, I don't think that one's in another slide, Dan. So I think the comment is a good one with respect to, okay, what is it that we want to see from these vessels? And so that's a good kind of metric that you've offered. And I think it kind of gives us a sense of the types of things folks might be interested in knowing. So I'm sure we could collect that from the various states that were kind of running these. Caitlin, anything to add to that?
I was just going to say that, yes, I think we can collect that information to the best of our abilities from the folks who were testing the devices. I don't know for certain that they have like a data proof way of recording that. So we will do our best to track that information down.
Thanks for that. Okay, let's flip to one more slide, and then I will take comments from the public as well as the board. So the next slide, I think, is another kind of straightforward one. So next slide, please. So the next question that came up a lot was when the trackers would be available for the entire industry that's going to need them, so they have time to plan ahead a little bit, get them ahead of that deadline date. And so, of course, the answer depends on the action taken by the board. If the program's approved, the implementation date could be adjusted to account for any like supply chain delays, things like that. However, there was some indication just from speaking with folks who had been thinking about these things for a while now, that they have been talking to vendors, and there's at this time plenty of stock for the numbers that we're kind of looking at. So those types of delays are not necessarily anticipated. Some of the things we hear about in the news and things like that, there's confidence that we'll likely be able to get these things. Now, the installation and the text to do that installation, all of that stuff does take time. So it's a fair question. But anyways, that's the question. There's the response so far. Anyone from the board wishing to comment further on this? Okay, not seeing any hands. I'd like to make a little time now for the public to ask some questions or make some comments on the slug of questions that we've gone through to this point. So Timothy Field, I see your hand up, and go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Hold on. Timothy, can you put your hand back up for me so I can unmute you?
Sorry,
Thanks.
Timothy.
Yep, you went too fast. All right, ready to go.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yeah, we got you now.
Okay, yep. So I'm a lobster fisherman. I'm located in Massachusetts. I would like to say that I did not attend any of the prior public meetings strictly because I was out fishing. I wasn't able to. I did, however, submit a written public comment, and I just have a few additional things I'd like to add to that. I'll try to keep it quick here. I'd like to say, first of all, regarding the cost, I mean, that is a big part of the opposition here because obviously the problem with this industry is we don't have the ability to pass along the cost to our consumers if we have increased costs. But I don't really see asking the federal government to pay for this as a good alternative either. We all know the federal government's broke, and I, for one, myself, don't want to burden future generations with any more debt. So I mean, the best suggestion I may come up with is maybe we should solicit the environmental groups, some of the groups that are pushing for this data, for them to raise money and donate it towards the fishermen to provide for these trackers. I'm sure they have the means, the ability to do so, and it may solve that problem, and it may get the two groups working together instead of against themselves all the time. Another thing I'd like to say is Lobster. We went to area management. We did that a long time ago because most regulations are not a one size fits all. So this tracking may be good for some areas, but it may not be good for other areas. So that's something to be considered. And then the idea that if managers had this data already, that any decisions would have been made differently. I find myself, I see that idea as ridiculous because BOEM controls, specifically regarding wind lease areas and energy development, BOEM controls those areas. They're the ones that define them and make the decisions for that. No input was asked from fishermen until the lease areas were already defined and the leases were already granted. As far as I know, no fisheries management bodies or state agencies went to bat for the fishermen and at least tried to change some of the areas or whatever, and then were shot down because they did not have the data to support it. And I would like to, I'd like to say, I mean, the lobstermen weren't the only ones affected by the wind farm lease areas. A number of the mobile gear guys in Rhode Island, like the squid fishermen, were, and they've had tracking requirements and all that data for years. So you see that obviously wasn't taken into consideration for that. And then regarding the use of the data as far as the whale interactions, I would say we'd be more willing. It'd be better useful if we knew where the whales were and not specifically where the fishermen were. I mean, unless the fishermen's data is going to be given priority over other things, specifically meaning that areas will not be closed because it's a area that's of high priority to the fishermen, even if it leads to an entanglement here or there. But I don't see that as a viable, as something that would happen anyway. It seems like the fishermen's needs are always given a backseat to other matters. So to me, it seems like if the managers had this data available, I don't see what good it would be used for. And then for the enforcement, granted, there is a need for the enforcement, but one thing that has not been mentioned is that there needs to be a very specific process. If they're talking about our gear being hauled and inspected by NOAA or the Coast Guard or state agencies for that, I know it's done inside of state waters in inshore areas, and that's different. But when you're talking offshore, it's a different thing. And the most troublesome thing that I see is what will the enforcement agencies do with the product that's currently in the traps while they inspect the gear. So I'll just give you an example where I fish.
Hey, Tim, Tim,
yep.
Sorry, it's we've got a lot to get through here. I think you noted that you've submitted some of this in a written comment. So I'd just ask that you not sort of rehash those. Is there any way you can wrap up here so we can get to some other folks?
Okay, well, yes. So one point I did not make in my written comment is that any fisherman that would like to submit his data, I mean, I'm sure they can voluntarily submit it. I know a lot of guys use I myself use Time Zero. It's our plotting software, and that plots your location all the time, whether you save tracks or not, and that can be easily put on a USB stick and sent to anybody if there's any need to prove where we were fishing, where we have been for the past few years, or anything like that. So I think that's about it for now. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Tim. I've got one other hand from the public up, Greg Mataronis. Greg, go ahead. I'm going to be fair here. I'm not going to put a timer on you, Greg, either, but I think from here on out, we may have to use the timer just to kind of keep the meeting rolling. So Greg Mataronis, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so I guess I'll start with this. We went through the slides that had the public comments and what they were in favor of, and also the AP, and both of those were in favor of status quo, but it appears from the gist of this meeting that things are just going to be moving forward regardless of the public comments and the AP's input. And I understand the need for this data, but that doesn't give a great, it's not a great look to be putting out to the industry and the public. I mean, I believe it was whatever it was, 27-3 in the public comments, and the AP was 5 or 6-3, something like that. So it's just not a great look. It appears this is going to steamroll through, but just a little bit of concerning. With regards to the public hearings, they were all virtual, and I completely understand the world that we're living in right now. That was necessary, but the attendance was severely limited because of that. When we went out to public comment for the large whale take reduction plan, there was, I believe, about six meetings there as well, 4 or 5 up in Maine, and there was hundreds of attendees from the industry. Some meetings had over 100. I attended 2 in the Maine area, also the one in Rhode Island, and the auditoriums were pretty full, and I think we lost a lot of the good public input based on the fact that it was virtual. And here we are trying to put so more electronic requirements on people that don't feel comfortable attending a meeting virtually. So we were talking about, you guys were talking about maybe adding language, and then it has to go out to public hearing again. I actually don't think that's the worst idea in the world, because hopefully, based on the way things are looking right now, maybe we will be able to have some in-person meetings. So if we need to add this language, which is going to make the industry more comfortable, going back out to public comment may get more input from people that didn't have a chance to. And that also leads into, I believe it was Mr. White was talking about having these questions answered and put in writing. I think that's super important, especially after hearing Ms. Kearns speak. She used the words intention and good faith effort multiple times. And as was discussed with VMS, the intention is not necessarily what is going to be the end product. So that's where we're looking for a little bit of protection, so to speak. So that way, it's nice to say the intention is not to keep us at the dock, but next thing you know, we've got EPOs coming down to the dock because we left thinking that, okay, we're going to get this fishing. It's 2 a.m. The thing's not working. We're going to go fishing and we'll get this repaired as soon as we can when we get back. But then we've got EPOs at the dock saying, oh, well, you didn't make a good faith effort, when at 2 a.m. there's nothing I can do if that unit is not working. There was the EVTRs are coming online for Lobster, as was mentioned. I think that seeing what type of data and the volume of data and the improvement in data is going to be very important. This industry tracking becomes less important. It will be less reliance upon it once there's that. So I'm not against having this take a little longer and delay, just based on, let's see what comes from those EVTRs. With regards to the having the rule in place for May 1st, we know how rulemaking goes, and it's very thorough. It takes a long time. Everything has to be vetted, go to general counsel. Suppose this announcement comes out April 1st and the vendors have all the stock. We still have to install that. Some people may not be able to install it themselves. There's only so many electronics places. So we're going to need more time than just, hey, that rule is in, you have 30 days. We're going to need more time. Not to mention, some people may have an issue coming up with the money up front to buy these things. And then my final thing is with regards to using the data to identify high priority areas for fishermen. So right now in Area 2, we have a massive closed area that, so when we have these trackers, it's going to show no usage of that area. And we also know that the largest wind energy area on this coast is right off of there, right smack dab in the middle of that closed area. And the hypocrisy of it all, that's going to be allowed for whale purposes while we're off the water with our 3/8 end lines. Very limited use, but to each individual fisherman, it's a significant part of our year that we're kicked out of that area. To see that, I just don't see where this data would help us. Basically, we're not going to have. Some guys would be fishing right in the middle. Actually, Tim Field's boat might be right in the middle of that right now, but he was forced to take his gear home. So now he'll show no effort in that area, which means that the wind farms have they're clear away. And I only see it as if there's minimal effort in an area, it's ultra important to that 1 or 2 or 3 fishermen. But if they say, okay, well, there's minimal effort there, we're going to make this a wind energy area, it's only going to work to take areas away. I apologize for being so pessimistic, but things are not getting better for fishermen. Let's just say that. I appreciate your time, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Okay, let's keep rolling here. Quite a few slides to get through. Next slide, please. So the next one is how will harvesters choose an appropriate device? So if we were to approve this program the next time we meet, the commission will issue an RFQ or request for quotes to identify available technology. And then a working group will be formed to review and approve devices. Basically, they're going to be putting out an RFQ with criteria in it and then seeing which vendors kind of come forward. So that's how we will generate the list of appropriate devices. And then this gets back to some of the public comments. We're discussing this nuance of what's required and where do the states have some flexibility. So here's one of those areas. So some of the states may choose to require a specific device while some might allow options. And so in that scenario where a state might allow multiple options, the commission will provide the states information on each of the approved devices. And so the harvester can kind of look through the list and kind of understand what each tracker does. And they're all going to have to do sort of the core things that we need from the tracker. So looking to the board, any hands on this one for clarification, additions, modifications? Allie Murphy, go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. In looking at the answer to this question, I'm definitely supportive of the first bullet about the RFQ and forming a working group to review and approve devices. That all matches with my memory of the PDT, PDT's development of this action. I guess I was a little surprised by the second bullet. My recollection was that, you know, the full suite of approved devices would be available and used by all of the states. And I guess I raise this in that it will be really hard for us to do complementary federal rulemaking if all of the states are doing something different. And it also potentially brings up some national standard for concerns about treating folks from different states differently. So I guess I'm wondering, is it maybe worth getting the PDT back together to hash through some questions like this?
Jason,
Yeah, good point. Yeah, go ahead, Tony.
A follow-up. I think where this is getting at is that we heard from some states that if they can find the appropriate funding, that they may try to strike a deal with one of the tracking devices that gets approved and say, we're going to order, I'm just making something up, 500 trackers from you. And then they'll say to get a discounted price. And then they'll say to their industry, we're going to pay for trackers from this vendor. If you want the state to pay for your tracker, then you will need to use this tracking device. If you want to choose a different previously approved tracker that's not this device, then you would need to pay for it yourself. So I think that that's what that's getting at, Allie. It's not to say that a harvester can't choose a different device. It's just that the state would pay for that one particular one in order to get a better deal for price. That's what we were hearing.
Response, Allie?
Yeah, thanks for that explanation, Tony. And I understand that. I guess just the the phrasing on this slide, that some states may choose to require that all harvesters use the same device, runs afoul of what you just said. So
We can fix that.
and more discussion or at the PDT or some wordsmithing of this, I think would be helpful.
Okay, good discussion. Thanks for that, Ally. A couple more hands here. David Borden, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I agree with Ally. I was a little bit troubled by that statement also. I mean, I just point out that one of the difficulties in trying to deal with this is there are quite a few different tracking devices. All the different tracking devices have different capabilities, and to some extent, what you're going to find if the commission goes down this road is that some individuals are going to want more capabilities on individual tracking devices. There are all kinds of engine monitoring, bilge alarms, all that kind of stuff. If you want to spend a lot of money, you can spend a lot of money on a fairly sophisticated tracking device. If you don't want to spend a lot of money, some of the states have already gotten estimates from some of the providers that the cost would get down in the $150 to $200 range for a tracker. So I think you got to be somewhat cautious about the language in this section. I also, as a final note, I think it would be a good idea to just have a virtual meeting with the providers that manufacture these things and let the technical people and the providers and any industry members that are interested just listen in on the discussion, talk about capabilities and so forth. And we're going to get into some of those issues that would come up in that type of discussion here soon. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Next up, I have Megan Ware. Go ahead, Megan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, maybe to Ally and David's point, I think Maine is a state we're maybe alluding to on this second bullet here, where we've talked about if we're able to secure funding, doing a bulk order of trackers and being able to distribute those to industry at a reduced cost in terms of the per unit cost of trackers. So I think that's what this is getting at, but Ally, maybe you and I can have a conversation between now and our next meeting, or the PDT chats, or both, because I think in that type of situation, potentially many Maine fishermen would be using the same device. And I do think there's some advantages there, just in terms of getting that data with the harvester reporting data and all the pathways that are needed to submit that data. But Ally, I'm happy to have an offline conversation with you to sort that out more between now and our next meeting.
Okay, thanks, Megan. All right, quick note that we have 5 minutes left in our allotted time, and I assure you there is more than 5 minutes left of slides here. I will try and tick through as expeditiously as possible. I'm hoping folks can hang in for a little while longer, and I'll try and get through, but there's I don't think there's any chance that we're not going to go over time at this point. So just to sort of call your attention to that. With that, let's flip to the next slide. There were a lot of questions about a grace period and this notion of kind of learning the tracker. I think the Cliff Notes response here is that, once the tracker is installed, it's not like EVTRs or some sort of new electronic reporting. These things are just sort of operating in the background. So there won't need to be necessarily a lot of interaction between the harvester and the device itself. And then if support is needed, for instance, if it stops working or something to that effect, between the state and or the vendor, that's where that support will come from. So you're not going to have to go to for instance, the commission, to try and sort out your tracker issue. You'll be able to do that locally between the vendor and your state agency. So any comments from anyone on this slide, this question? Okay, not seeing any hands there. Let's move on to the next slide. How will states certify that vessels required to install tracking devices have done so? So the states are going to develop a process by which they will certify that installation and the activation of the approved device. That will be required for the principal port listed on the federal fishery permit. So that's how you'll know which state you are supposed to kind of do that part with. There will likely be an affidavit. That affidavit will have uniform language that will be distributed to the states, to their permit holders, and can be used to certify and approve those tracking devices. Again, for initial implementation, the states will collaborate to define a deadline by which the permit holders will need to have that tracker installed. And then finally, the ACCSP, who is the sort of collector, the receiver of the data, will be able to confirm that the trackers are activated and working properly, because they will receive that information. So any questions? Pat Gear, go ahead, Pat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In Virginia, we're a very small player in this, and we only have 8 federal permittees that may require a tractor. Only 2 of them have qualifying landings, and those landings are less than, it's minimal, less than $1,000 a year, roughly like that. Talking to the folks in our state that may be impacted, they have said that they would basically stop fishing for lobster if they were required to do this, because the cost of the devices is going to be more than what they land. So how would I verify that they're not fishing for, if they decide they're not going to fish for these species, they won't be required to have a tracker, but how do I verify that?
Good question, Pat. Caitlin or Tony, you want to take a crack at that?
I guess, Mr. Chair, I can try to answer that. So my understanding is that if a person is fishing for lobster and therefore reporting landings of lobster on a trip report, then they should be, from trap year, then they should be required to have this tracker. So if you see that coming in to your trip reports, then that's how you would see if a person is meant to have a tracker. And if they don't have that data going to ACCSP, you would get that report from ACCSP and be able to see that as well. So okay. I don't know if that completely answers it for you, Pat.
That was kind of, I didn't know if there was something else besides the trip reports. That's what I was thinking as well, but okay.
Okay, thanks for that, Caitlin, and thanks, Pat. I don't see any other hands, so why don't we go ahead and move to the next slide. So the next one is what will be required of harvesters if their tracking device stops working, and folks were worried about having to kind of stay tied up and things of that nature. So in the addendum, it indicates that upon receiving information that the device is not working, the first step is for that harvester to contact the state authority to report that failure. And then once that's reported, the intention is that the harvester, making a good faith effort to repair the device, would be allowed to continue fishing while the device is under repair or being replaced. So that notion of tying up to the dock because your tracker is broken, that kind of speaks to that point. That standard procedure for how the states will receive reports from harvesters with device failures, whether they'll have a dedicated phone line or if email will suffice, that will be established. But in the end, the intention is to allow flexibility for these types of procedures in a way that makes sense for the states, whatever works for their fishermen and for the facilities that they have in those states. And so finally, the procedures will take into account that harvesters may need to report device issues outside of normal business hours. So something like, an email can be sent whenever, and will be sort of queued up. So that's the response to that one. I've got some hands there. The first one I saw was Dave Borden. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is a good example of a section of this addendum that really needs a lot of work and a lot of discussion by the technical people. I mean, as I indicated before, I listened to a lot of the hearings, and this issue came up at almost every hearing from a variety of different perspectives. And candidly, I'm not sure that it was well thought out in terms of the process. I mean, I think the reality is with a fisherman and a tracker, the only thing that the fisherman can guarantee is that there is a tracker on board, that it's been connected to a power source, and that it's operating. The individual will never know unless there's some kind of light system on the tracking device when it's transmitting data over the phone lines. So I just conclude by saying I think this needs a lot of work. I don't think that we should necessarily spend a lot of time on the part of the board trying to refine this. This is an issue that should go to the technical people and take the industry comments and try to come up with a better way of handling this. Most tracking devices have lights on them. So when a fisherman is on their boat, they start the engine, they can look into wherever it's being housed and look at a light that indicates that the device is on. But the rest of this is beyond their control. In terms of the notification process, I think it would be much better to have a notification process whereby the individual is responsible with the state agency of getting the device installed, which is relatively simple, I would point out, having used one, and then thereafter, ACCSP and the state agency work out a notification where once that device stops transmitting, there's some notification that goes from ACCSP to the state agency and the fishermen telling them that, rather than going the other way. Thank you. Sorry to take so long.
That's okay. Thanks, David. And you started in on the next slide as well. So maybe that one will go a little quicker. I do have some other hands. Next up is Richie White. Go ahead, Richie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so I think a standard procedure, so that is just within the state, or is that going to be Atlantic States determined standard procedure? And I think a big part of this is what's the definition of, a fisherman's showing good effort to get this fixed. I think that needs to be defined specifically. And I, agree with what David said. Unless there's a light on the box, and if the light's off, then they have to, call in or email or whatever. So, as Dave said, this needs a lot of work. Thank you.
Yep, good points. Thanks, Richie. Next up, I have Steve Train. Go ahead, Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't want to say the same thing that's already been said. I can echo the sentiment, but you're talking about a lot of small boats in this fishery. Even though they're a little bit bigger once they get outside the 3-mile line into federal waters, they're still small boats. They're open boats. People tend to put sensitive electronics someplace that they aren't going to get wet, and they probably can't see them. So you could start that boat in the morning, see the light go on and take off, and you could be 9 hours into the day and find out it's shut off an hour in. You haven't reported it, and next thing you know, you're getting boarded by Marine Patrol because you're active and you weren't supposed to be out there because your tracker's off. You didn't even know it. And that would be a lot of boats that keep these things out of the way. So that type of thing really needs to be taken into account. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
If I could follow up, Mr. Chair.
Yep, go ahead.
I just want to hopefully provide some more clarification on, I think, what has been envisioned by the folks who have tested the trackers and ACCSP as we were working with the PDT to develop this document. So these data are not going to be going to enforcement in real time. The likelihood is that the trackers will collect data as lobstermen are heading out, and they may stop collecting or stop transmitting the data back to the vendors while they're out of cell network range. And then when they come back into cell network, they'll transmit the data to the vendors. That data will then get transferred to ACCSP, and that may not be an immediate thing. And then ACCSP will have to get a trip report, which also may come in later, and match that to the vessel track. And ACCSP has indicated that they would be able to make some kind of algorithm to identify an issue where, say, a tracking device does get shut off or stop working mid-trip, and they see that in the track, it just ends halfway through a trip. So they can make an automated way to report that type of issue to the state. And then, so I do think this has been thought through. Maybe more text could be put into this guidance document that we've discussed, but the idea is that the states would get notified of an issue, and potentially then they would reach out to the harvester and let them know that there's an issue, and then the harvester would be contacting the vendor to get that issue resolved. And that is written in the addendum in page 11 under the data, sorry, I'm trying to find it, the tracking, some of the specifications do kind of describe that process. So I hope that provides some clarity that I don't think there is an expectation that the harvesters would know for sure at every minute whether their device is transmitting the data.
Thanks for that, Caitlin. And just, I think the comments are good. It seems like we need a little more fleshing out of this. I think some of it has been thought through already, as Caitlin noted, but just kind of packaging it now so folks kind of understand a little more of the detail is the next step here. So good discussion.
And Jason, one other thing I think that I've heard people say, and I think what Caitlin and I need help from the state itself or the administrators, I'm not necessarily sure it's the technical folks that need to determine how that fisherman reports that their device isn't working. For those that can see that, if they see that the light isn't on and they're getting ready to go out, what they do, I think that's an administrative procedure that we need the states to tell us what their plan is in terms of setting up a reporting system. So, Caitlin and I can say that a reporting system will be established, but I can't tell you exactly what that would be for each state. We would need you all to tell us that in order to give a response for that. So we'll need some help there.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. So my interpretation of, I think what you said is spot on. My interpretation, going back to David Borden's comments, who sort of indicated the technical committee, is they're just the kind of point of contact, right? But it would be their responsibility to kind of work with their bosses or whoever to kind of figure out what you just referred to. So that's kind of how I interpreted that. It's just a procedural thing rather than this is being a technical issue. Okay, got a few more hands here. Dan McKiernan, go ahead, Dan.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure if it's germane to this slide or a future one, but I think in the same topic, there needs to be some clarification about vessel breakdown / replacement. Sometimes we get calls for a permit holder to want to use an alternative vessel temporarily if they blew the engine and someone else is going to loan them the vessel. There needs to be a way to accommodate that. And so some language needs to be at least maybe initially agreed upon by maybe the state directors about how we'd like to see that go forward, especially in consultation with NIMS.
Yeah, good point, Dan. Having gone through all the questions here, I don't think that one has come up at all. So that's a good one that needs some work. Caitlin can correct me if I'm off on that, but I didn't see that in the questions anyways. I got a couple more hands. Allie Murphy, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, I don't need to speak too long to this point. I've said it before, but I think, to the extent that the states can implement consistent programs, that would certainly make rulemaking easier for us. I'll also point out, and I think I pointed out to the PDT, that this is another information collection thing that if we were to go through federal rulemaking would require Paperwork Reduction Act approval. So that potentially could delay the rulemaking from taking place for not having a lot of these details fleshed out.
Thanks, Allie. Dave Borden, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'll be really brief. Allie just made the point about consistency, and I think it's really important for the board and whoever is going to work on this to keep in mind that you've got fishermen, Maine fishermen fish out of Massachusetts ports. Maine fishermen fish out of New Hampshire ports and vice versa. So consistency in a policy would be really beneficial from a communications perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Okay, we ran out of hands, so let's flip to the next slide, please. So this is we've kind of started in on this already, but as mentioned by a couple of folks, how will the harvester know if the tracking device is working? As mentioned by a couple of folks, they're kind of device specific, but a lot of them have indicator lights on them. And then finally, it won't be the sole responsibility of the harvester to know that the device is properly transmitting data. The vendors and the ACCSP will also be on the team there to sort of notify folks if something seems to be not working correctly on their device. So I think Caitlin sort of spoke to this a moment ago, but if there's anyone else who has any remaining comments they want to make on this aspect, please raise your hand. Okay, not seeing any hands, so let's flip to the next slide. This, there you go. This one had to do with some of the technical aspects. So one question that people had was about the power draw from the devices. People concerned about burning their battery out and the bilge pump not working and things like that. So in general, the tracking devices, the ones that were studied, consume very little power, even at the kind of high ping rate that we're requiring. There's a little bit of technical information there as far as the exact draw, so folks can make a judgment there, but it's generally a low, very low draw. Another thing is the tracking device will not require power from the vessel when the vessel's engine is off. Therefore, it's not drawing from the vessel battery because many of them include an internal battery for those periods. And then when the vessel's in port, the proposed requirements stipulate that it will drop down from that high ping rate to 1 ping per day, just to kind of check in on your boat to make sure it's still there. And so, that's this kind of sleep or low power mode. And then I just add in here, the second question, technical question, was how do the trackers perform in cold weather? And all of the devices tested were run on lobster vessels throughout the winter months. So, I think this gets back to one of the earlier slides where, we said we'll try and capture some of these other metrics. from the vessels that did use them, but this is one of them. We do have information from them on vessels that were run during the cold months, so we have that information. And I think the implication is that they performed perfectly fine in the cold weather. It wasn't an issue for them. So any hands on these two items here, which are technical in nature? Dave Borden, go ahead.
Yeah, this question, thank you, Mr. Chairman. On this fourth bullet, the home port, I completely support that concept, but how does if a tracker is only going to ping itself once a day, how does it know at that rate that it hasn't moved? And I think that's a technical question for someone like Bill DeVoe.
Yeah, maybe I'll start with Caitlin to see if she has a response first.
I can try, Mr. Chair, but I really do think Bill might be a better person to answer it. I think that even if it's not actively recording the location with a ping, it still knows where it is. It still knows its location and would be able to turn the ping rate back up as soon as it leaves that berth location. So I'm gonna leave it at that and see if Bill can maybe add some finer detail.
Yep, Bill, I see you in the queue there. Please feel free to jump in.
Yep, thank you. Yeah, to answer David's question, I mean, Caitlin is correct that in some implementations, if the device was actually still on, it would know its location, it would know when it was moving. The other concept that we're piloting is that when the device, particularly if it has a battery internally, like many of them do, if the device is not on external power, then that's a pretty good indicator that it doesn't need to be pinging. I mean, the expectation is that while the boat is running, while the engine's running, and fishing operations are taking place, that the tracker will be powered externally. The loss of that external power is a pretty good indicator that the tracker doesn't need to ping at that faster rate.
Thanks for that, Bill. So a couple of variations depending on the tracker there, but good response. Dave, follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is another quick one. So Bill, in the case of, and this is just an example of the question, in a port situation like New Bedford, where some of the boats are on the Fairhaven side and they get bait and fuel on the other side of the harbor, which in some cases might be 1.5 miles, they will be able to move in that area before the ping rate goes up, or would the ping rate go up and then go down again?
Bill, if you have a response, please feel free.
Yeah, so I think that depends on which sort of scenario that we're throttling the ping rate back using. If the ping rate's being slowed down within a certain distance of a location that's been determined as, home port, then yeah, what you're saying, David, that the ping rate would be slower within that entire bubble is absolutely correct. The other scenario, if it's just that you're doing a slower ping rate when you're on battery power, then, which is honestly the scenario that I'm leaning toward more and more, or some combination of the two. We've had really good results with the home port detection in terms of, it's really nice to get an alert when the vessel is going in and out of port. But in terms of actually managing the ping rate, it seems like the easier solution is to have the tracker connected in such a way that it receives external power when the engine is on. So in that scenario, as long as the engine was on, it would still be pinging at a 1-minute rate when they were going for fuel and ice and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good discussion. I'm not seeing any more hands, so let's flip to the next slide. Okay, this was a question about VMS devices. being acceptable as an alternative for, buying a second track, one of the cellular devices. So the addendum doesn't specify that VMS devices can't be used. There are some considerations that make VMS devices undesirable for this program. These are satellite technologies, so the cost is higher. And so that could be, if the current, if they're in the groundfish fishery or something like that, that's the reason they have a VMS. If the ping rate is something less, they would need to ramp that up, and so that would add to what is already a pretty expensive device. So it may in fact be cheaper to sort of purchase the second device. Additionally, the data collected from the VMS won't be going to ACCSP. That gets stored at NOAA's Office of Law Enforcement, and so that increases the bureaucracy around the data access to some degree. And then finally, if a VMS device were approved by the commission work group, in other words, that it meets the required criteria for the program, then it would be accepted. It would be a viable device to use, but it would still have to have that 1 minute ping rate. So that part would have to match up. So that's the discussion on VMS. Does anybody need anything further there? Other questions on the swapping in of a VMS or the use of an existing VMS? Dave Borden, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for talking this much. This is one of the issues that we raised in our letter, and it was raised to my attention, to the association's attention by one of our members in New Hampshire, who has VMS on all their vessels, is a communication service. The VMS provides a number of other services other than location information, for instance, up-to-date weather reports and the like. So he raised the question of being able to use this, his existing VMS, and just having a higher ping rate. I explained to him that that would cost him more money than just putting a tracking device. And his basic reaction was he didn't want to have duplicate electronics if he could avoid it on the boats. So he has expressed a willingness to work with whomever, New Hampshire Fish and Wildlife, the technical people or whatever, and do a little experiment using his own money to try different ping rates with his VMS, if that would be something that would have appeal. I'd also note as a final point that Maine Lobster Association raised the same concern. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Megan Ware, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I saw this comment a couple of times in the public comment record. So I guess the question I would have, and maybe this is for Allie Murphy, is, if there was a situation where VMS was used with I'll say a 10-minute ping rate, something faster than the 30 minutes for scallops or the hour for groundfish. And I'm curious what NOAA's thoughts are on the implementation of that. I mean, would that require a different declaration code for the lobster fishery? So you'd have to declare into the lobster fishery. Would that ping rate apply to all trips kind of as like a most restrictive rule, or would it just apply to lobster trips? I'm curious if NOAA has any thoughts on that.
Good question, Megan. Maybe a little technical for an on-the-spot response, but I'll give a shot. Allie, if you want to jump in on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, Megan, those are certainly good questions. I guess on the applicability of the ping rate, yeah, I wouldn't necessarily put it all on NOAA Fisheries. I would say, it might be up to the board or the PDT to review whether that meets the goals of the program. I haven't really workshopped any ideas around with modifying our regs for VMS. I think you make great points that typically we, when implementing regs for a program, that the most restrictive rule applies. So that fastest ping rate would apply to everything. I haven't brought this idea up to VMS folks yet, but I think it would probably lead to some heartburn. But I'm certainly happy to have some conversations going forward.
Okay, thanks, Ally. And yeah, this could be another area where we kind of use this time between now and when we meet next to flesh this out a little bit more. So thanks for that. Okay, I don't see any more hands, so let's move on to the next slide. There was a lot of questions that came up about the data itself. The first was who will be able to view the vessel tracking data? And the response to that is the vessel tracking data will be protected under state and federal confidentiality laws. That prohibits the disclosure of that confidential data or any data that can lead to the identification of either individuals or individual contributions to the data set. Access to confidential data is closely controlled. There are all sorts of systems that need to be followed and waivers signed and things of that nature to be able to gain access to confidential data. However, the harvesters themselves will be able to access and distribute their own data as they desire. It's theirs, so or yours. So of course, you'd be able to get your own data, but as far as anyone else getting that data will be tightly controlled. So that's the response there. Questions on this one? Looking for hands. Okay, not seeing any hands. Let's flip to the next slide. I do believe we are getting close to the end here. Two more, and then I will go back out to the public at that point as well. So I've got two on here. First is how will these data be used by law enforcement? So the tracking data won't be available to law enforcement in real time, and it won't be a primary source for making a case. In other words, it's not envisioned that somebody is going to go to court holding the data set and trying to use that to make a case. However, law enforcement may use the data to support investigations. So they kind of, this is the notion that they see something odd going on in the data and then sort of use that as information to then go out on the water to investigate. Access to data by law enforcement personnel is exactly the same as access by any other individual, in that the data are protected by the state and federal confidentiality laws and require relevant non-disclosure agreements for release. So there's some discussion on some information on data used by law enforcement. And then a kind of subsequent question is how will data be presented while still maintaining confidentiality? The ACCSP, they have a policy for confidentiality that requires that any data summary that's publicly disclosed must include information from at least 3 dealers, 3 harvesters, and 3 vessels to be considered non-confidential. So it gets pretty, aggregated before it can be released per the ACCSP rules, which are all very clearly defined to folks when they sign those agreements. So looking for hands, questions on these 2 questions. Megan Ware, go ahead.
Thank you. I'll start by saying I appreciate kind of the first answer here under the first bullet about how tracking data is going to be used. I think it's really important to note that this is a tool for patrol agencies. I think maybe there's a perception that enforcement is going to be behind a computer watching tracks, and I don't think that's a reality of what's going to happen. I know that's not a reality of what's going to happen, so I think it's just important to be clear on that. I did have a question about the third bullet under the first one, access to data by law enforcement personnel, and I'm hoping for a little more information about how that's actually going to work, or if that hasn't been discussed, maybe this is something the PDT could work on. So for example, is law enforcement personnel going to have an ACCSP account that they log into to access this information, or what's the vision here for how enforcement will actually access tracking data?
Thanks, Megan. I will look to, just to make a quick comment, my guess is it would be similar to like how a technical committee member sort of interacts with ACCSP data, the waivers they have to sign, all that sort of thing. But I'll look to Caitlin maybe to give a little more detail there.
I'm actually going to step in for Caitlin. I think I did a lot of this research on my end, Jason. And
yep, go ahead.
And I actually will ask Julie DeFlippi to answer this. But to my understanding, law enforcement, in terms of accessing other state data, they already have to sign. I think that you have reciprocal agreements with the JEAs and other NDA forms as a law enforcement officer that they undergo. So it's my understanding that through their law enforcement positions that they've already somewhat signed confidentiality agreements. But Julie, you can correct me if I'm wrong. And then once Julie answers that question, Jason, I just have an updated bit of information about FOIA requests that the board had asked about as well.
Okay, thanks, Tony. And Julie, please jump in. Yeah, I see you there. Go ahead, Julie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, Tony is right that there might be additional forms that law enforcement may sign, but ACCSP sees law enforcement as with no ill intent, just like anyone else, essentially. And so the law enforcement agent would have to sign, have non-disclosure agreements on file with the agency that owns the tracking data. So there would have to be an additional NDA signed, similar to how any state data manager, even if they have a form signed locally with their agency, will still need to sign one, have one on file with ACCSP in order to access the data. So essentially, there has to be a form on file with the ACCSP in order to have access to the data, similar to anyone else that would want access to the data. Does that answer the question asked?
I thought that sounded like a good answer, Julie. Thank you for that. Tony, did you want to jump back in?
Yeah, just really quickly, I just wanted to let folks know that the commission itself is not subject to the same rules as federal agencies are under FOIA requests. But I did check for both agencies about FOIAs, or what the commission calls information requests, and neither body would give out any information that is confidential to a FOIA request. It still would have to hold within the standards that we fall under through the different confidentiality laws, either through the states or the federal government. So it was one of the issues that had been raised during the meetings. So.
Okay, thanks for that, Tony. And just sort of looping back, I think it was Megan who sort of initiated the discussion. So Megan, are you good with all of that?
I am, thank you.
Great. Okay, got another hand. Maureen Davidson, go ahead, Maureen.
you, Jay. Sitting here listening, I appreciate the effort that's being made before final action is taken on this issue. I'm also looking at the end result of all of this effort, not just us coming to a final action and we're putting the trackers on the vessels and we're collecting the information. What I'd like to know is, at the end, who's going to take the data that we're collecting at the end of some specific time and use the data to get a final analysis on our more detailed knowledge of where our lobstermen are fishing? Is it going to be the state? Is it going to be NOAA? Is it going to be ACCSP? I just want to know, like, what do we see happening in the future with this information when we're going to make a decision about vertical lines, or we're going to make a decision about turbines in the ocean? You know, who's going to get this final data that we collect?
Yep, thanks, Maureen. Maybe I'll start with Caitlin for a response.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my understanding, Maureen, is that the data would be used for all of those purposes that you mentioned. And I think, you know, similar to when we have a stock assessment, there would have to be a data request for a certain set of data, time frame, geographical frame, what have you, and that request would be made specific to the purpose for which it's going to be used. So if we use the stock assessment as an example, the stock assessment subcommittee would, the states would rather provide their state data for that purpose. And so I think that, you know, for any of those issues that you brought up, we would have a similar process where the states are requested to provide their data for that use. So the states would be the owners of the data and would have the ability to provide it.
Good with that response, Maureen?
If I may follow or just to comment, I guess when I was thinking about the data that we're collecting here and the effort that we're putting in with our fishermen, then what we're doing now is just really establishing a new means of collecting more detailed fishing effort without necessarily having a specific project in mind. I mean, we have projects in mind, but it's not like at some point we are going to make some sort of decision based on this extra data that we're collecting. It's just sort of like a VTR or a vessel monitoring system or something like that. I guess I was imagining that we would say something about, you know, the northern right whale, or we would say something about, well, specifically the whale, I guess is what I'm thinking about. But I guess that's not really the purpose of this.
Yeah, so maybe I'll defer. I appreciate your comment, but I'll defer to Caitlin, and maybe Caitlin, you know, I might have a comment too, but I'll go to you first.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So it does say, it describes in the addendum the various purposes for which this data was imagined to be used, and the right whale issue is among those. It's one of the important reasons that this addendum was initiated, to collect these data. So I don't know if I agree with the sentiment that that there was no project in mind for the data. I don't think that we put the details of exactly how those data would be used in the risk reduction models, or exactly how they would go into the assessment, because those processes are very complicated and hard to flesh out, and there's no way, I don't think there's any way the PDT would be able to actually put those specifics in there. But those are the projects for which the data were originally envisioned, and I'm sure there are more applications that they could be used for in the future if that's the will of the board or state agencies.
And Jason, if I could just add to that, it's not that, you know, Caitlin is correct that these models that get used are complicated, but, you know, by enhancing the data that the trackers would, the enhanced data that the trackers would provide, will provide an opportunity to improve the models so that, you know, we'll have
perhaps new models, new applications of the data that we can't foresee until we have that information. The modelers can look at it and make decisions about exactly how they would be used. So we just can't foresee that at this moment to be able to put the exact application in the document as well.
Yeah, and Maureen, maybe, so I just, this one was something that came up during the Rhode Island hearing that I attempted to address. This question came up, and I attempted to address it. I don't think I did a very good job for all of the reasons that Caitlin and Tony just offered. But I do think while we absolutely cannot create an exhaustive list of exactly how this data would be used, I think we could do a little more there to kind of give folks some confidence that, we're not just sort of collecting the data, I don't know, building the airplane as we're flying it, I think is the sort of common term. I think we have thought about this. There are uses that people envision for the stock assessment, for the right, the risk model for right whales, for spatial planning. So maybe that's another element that we could kind of flesh out a little more between now and when we revisit this. So good comments. Anything further there, Maureen?
No, thank you. Actually, you've clarified the issue a lot more in my head. I guess I was always thinking of some sort of not an end point, but an end purpose that we would get an answer on something. But I understand, I appreciate everyone's explanation and the discussion. It has clarified the point for me. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Maureen. David Borden, go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Quick point on the last bullet. Having had to live by that rule in a prior existence I had, it works well. It protects the industry, but in this case, the data that's going to be collected, some of this data is going to be so sensitive that you could find a situation where even if the technical folks adhered to that last bullet, that it would be releasing too much information. In other words, and I can give you a simple example. If you had a 10-minute square where you had 10 dealers and 50 fishermen that were fishing in it that met that requirement, you would not want to put out a heat map of catch per unit of effort that showed the catch in that and contrasted it with the two abutting 10-minute squares. So I think we've got to be sensitive to that going forward and maybe be overly conservative on the release of any information. Thank you.
Good comments, David, thanks. Okay, no more hands, so let's flip to what is the last slide, thankfully. In this one, these were a series of questions. Sorry, next slide, please. The last one here was a series of questions that we didn't necessarily have responses to, but we just wanted to kind of round out the list here and note that some of these probably need further interaction with the technical committee, the PDT, or the law enforcement committee. So the first one is the one we were just talking about with Maureen. And so I won't harp on that one, but it's how the data will be used with a little more specificity, and I think we can do that, at least by way of some examples. How do fishermen get access to their data? Like what data products will be available to them? I don't know how useful it would be for them to get a big matrix of Latin long information, and so we should probably think through what types of data products and maybe find out what types of data products the fishermen want. And that doesn't need to be resolved immediately, but we can work on that, and that can evolve through time. What determines if track data meet the requirements once tracks are matched with reported trips? I'm sorry, who determines that? So kind of a governance question there. What is the process when an issue with tracking data, in other words, data inconsistent with specifications, is identified? Who enforces the regulations, the states or the federal government? And finally, what are the consequences of individuals not adhering to the regulations? In other words, if they aren't using a tracker. So those are some final questions that we heard, didn't necessarily have responses to immediately, but we can refer those out to some of these other committees that can help us flesh those out a little bit. So just looking to the board right now, anything you want to add to any of these? Have we missed any other things that you heard? Anything else anyone wants to add at this point? Looking for hands.
Jason, since there aren't any hands, I just want to, I think that moving forward here, it's the expectation from what I'm hearing from you all is that you want to come back and meet again in roughly a month's time in order to reconsider this document. And there are a couple of questions in particular on this slide that we haven't really discussed too much, that I think they're more administrative questions than PDT, TC, or law enforcement committee questions. Maybe that we'll get a little bit of input from some of those groups, but that these are things that we're really going to need the state administrators to help us with. And so Caitlin and I probably will ask for a call with you all relatively quickly so that we can try to flesh out some of these questions that are administrative procedures versus technical things that we can work on with the various committees. So I just wanted to kind of put that heads up out there. And so for you all to be thinking about some of these things prior to us reaching out, but to have it on your radar.
No, that's awesome, Tony. Really good point. I think that's a great approach because, like you said, I think it'll take a little bit of discussion, like we were talking about earlier, trying to bounce that through a technical committee representative. Let's just go straight to the administrator themselves. So I think that's a great idea. One other thing I thought I'd mention. Oh, actually, let me go. Roy, you haven't had your hand up yet, so go ahead, Roy Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very quickly, how will these hearing questions and responses be incorporated or disseminated to the public? Will they become an appendix to the addendum? Or what's the plan for that? Thank you.
Yeah, that's awesome, Roy. That's exactly where I was just about to go. So, right. I think, we've gone, now 50 minutes over time, kind of working through these. We know there's some work that's going to occur between now and the next time we meet. Some of that work is going to have to happen at the state level. So I can ask Tony or Caitlin to kind of check me, but what I envisioned happening was everything we talked about today and that subsequent work is going to go into a document. That document will then be distributed out to the states, and then the states can interact with their constituents in whatever manner they think is most appropriate. So it might be a workshop, again, sponsored by the state and not the commission, but a workshop or posting on a website or something of that nature. But that's what I envision is there's a step in this process for the states to kind of grab a hold of this and get it out to their folks. We've gone through the trouble, they've gone through the trouble to kind of get these questions in front of us. We're now going to try and do a better job of getting responses, direct responses, clear responses to these questions, and getting it back out to them so they can see that. So I don't know if anybody has a comment on that, but that's what I envisioned. Maybe I could start with Tony or Caitlin. Is that kind of what you guys were thinking would happen as well?
Jason, yeah, Caitlin and I will update the FAQs. We'll add these additional questions that are here to the extent of some of them we can answer, and add some things to the other questions that were here. And then, we can, if it's the desire of the board, we could post the questions on the Lobster page, the FAQs, as well as obviously post responses as part of the meeting materials. We didn't do that before because we weren't sure what the states wanted us to do. So if that's the desire of the board to post the answers to these questions, meeting materials, we can, but in order to have additional discussions or engagements with your fishermen, we envision that to be up to the individual states.
Great, thanks, Tony. Couple of hands up here. Roy, your hand is up. I don't know if that's a new question, but if it is, feel free to jump in. Oh, hand went down. Richie, go ahead, Richie White.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I kind of envision pulling this document together, then providing it to the board, and to see if the board then, if there's any board members that have any additional clarification, and the states then that want to hold some kind of public meeting then can do that, and then listen to questions and input from the fishermen. And then after that, then a meeting would be scheduled. So I guess my question would be, does that, to staff, does that look that process could be doable in a month? Thanks.
Tony or Caitlin?
I think, yeah, Caitlin and I can turn around the questions as they are today. How fast some of these other additional questions that require administrative processes, that's a little bit back to the board. We can't answer those questions. We need the states to help us. I don't know how fast the states can turn around those questions. I will, and we would like to try to get a meeting on the books sooner than later so that we don't miss opportunities to save your dates and your schedules. End of March, or well, early April, we start to overlap with some of the councils. So we would just need to get a date on the books relatively quickly.
Thanks, Tony. Is that okay by you, Richie?
I guess it will depend on how fast, we see the new document. I mean, I think we're going to need, I'm kind of speaking for Cherie, but I would think we're going to need, a couple weeks to pull together a date to meet with the fishermen. So maybe it can work. It seems pretty tight, but hopefully. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Richie. Agree. Okay. Cherie, go ahead, Cherie.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, it'll be a tight fit, but I think we can make it work if we can get the information back as soon as possible. Thanks.
Great. All right. I would like to offer another opportunity for any public that might still be hanging on out there to offer any comments. I kind of took a pause in the middle there, and now I'm taking another opportunity. I think we will, I'd love to end this as close to 4 as possible. So I think we will pull the timer up for folks, but I do want to offer another opportunity for any public that wants to offer if we've missed something here. So I'm looking for hands from the public. Okay, maybe the fact that this is going to come back out to the states and then we'll be convening again is good enough. So, all right. So that is all of the questions, everybody. I think we're pretty close to wrapping here. We've talked a little bit about next steps. So I think we have a decent sense of that. Is there anything anyone on the board wants to clarify before we start to think about adjourning? I'm not seeing any hands. So why don't we go ahead and is there anyone who wishes to make a motion to adjourn? Sherry?
Yes, sir.
So there's a motion to adjourn. Is there a second? Ray Kane seconds, I'm guessing. And with that, are there any objections to adjourning the meeting? And thanks from me to all of you for hanging in for so long. Not seeing any hands in objection. That's a wrap. Thanks, everybody. Meeting's adjourned.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, everyone.